First, I've invited Jonathan to give us a welcome since he wasn't able to be here for orientation this year. He had some very important business abroad, so I think it'll be good for him to say hello, especially for our new cohort who maybe hasn't had the chance to meet him yet. And then we have two very exciting presentations from our students. One from Yanya, who is defended successfully her dissertation, and this is the last thing to fulfill her requirements. And then Joy Cox just defended her proposal for her dissertation, so she's going to give us some overview of what her dissertation is going to be about as she continues to work on that. So for the time being, I'll turn over to Jonathan while we continue to pull stuff up and let him say a quick hello.
The screen still goes up. Hi everyone. This is a really exciting day. There's lots of familiar faces here as well as new faces, so it's a good combination. Sorry, I was doing something very important. I can't remember what it was, but very important. Very important for the other event. So let me say a little bit about me. I'll say a little bit about the scholarship that I'm involved in, a little bit about the role of Dean here and about the school, and then I'll open up to any questions or thoughts, comments, compliments. All kinds of speech acts are available in this lot, or there might even be a talk from someone else. So I've been here 2 years, 1 month and 2 days, so I'm kind of pretty well established now. As you may be able to tell, I'm not from around here. John Oliver says I'm putting this accent on. I grew up in Tennessee, but that really isn't true. I grew up in a small village on the south coast of Britain, in Sussex. Not the Sussex here, but Sussex over there, the other one. I spent much of my academic career in Loughborough University in the UK, or as my Texan friends call it, lowbrow university, because it's got 4 G's in it, so it really doesn't sound like it looks. If you Google it, if you can Google it, you'll see it's a pretty research-intensive university, great colleagues and so on, but I was winkled out to come to a really special institution where I've had long-standing links, and Sky has been a really wonderful home for me. Fantastic colleagues, extraordinary intensity of research, wonderful university environment, and of course the New Jersey cultural environment within which we swim is just wonderful too. So that's all very good. I started my academic career, my first publication was in 1979, so I'm like 150 years old, and I was originally trained as a psychologist, although I did a PhD in sociology and a master's in philosophy of science, and I taught statistics. It's my first job, which was fantastically exciting, and I still quite enjoy that. I am probably most well known over the years for discourse analysis in social psychology, book which is like taught in lots of places, but is like 1987, so a million years old, and representing reality, which is also very old, but still cited a lot. I'm still doing scholarship as well as my leadership stuff, and I believe that I'm being invited at some point to talk about that, which would be great. But I work on, well, I'm originally known for work on racism. I did a lot of that in the 1980s. Still a very live topic. It since hasn't gone away, sadly. I'm known as being part of the development of discursive psychology as a perspective, which is still very significant. I do work on child protection helplines and interaction on those helplines, on emotion and interaction, particularly upset, anger, eating, family meal times, so a range of topics like that. But I also am engaged with various kind of methodological issues. So I'm known as someone who says irritatingly negative things about qualitative research interviews. Although I love that as a topic, I just have got standards that I'm trying to pressure. Okay, so that's kind of me. You can follow me on Twitter, Jonathan Potter 6. Those of you who tweet, I try and have my Twitter feed as capturing my kind of dean's role, so it shows me cycling my bike and sitting in meetings and trying to set up events. For example, I was recently in London, which is why I wasn't able to go to the PhD thing, exploring with King's College there the possibility in the longer term of building a program of creative media and cultural industries. And I'm still very excited about that as a possibility. The school. You know quite a lot about the school. You obviously researched it intensively before applying, and probably even more intensively now you've arrived, or if you've been here for a while, you know all about it. It's got a very, very warm ethos. It's very welcoming. I've loved that. I've enjoyed and been pampered by that, and I try and support that aspect. It's very interdisciplinary. Across the 3 departments, there are a whole range of areas which cross-fertilise one another. Like media and analytics appears in several places. Data science cuts across. An interest in health comes across the different departments, and so on. And I'm very keen on that interdisciplinary ethos, and of course it's enshrined in our PhD program, and I'm very pleased that it's there. You'll see if you look on the website that we have a number of very strong established research centres, research labs, and I encourage you to, even the ones that are a bit away from your area, go look at what they do, talk to the people involved in those, see the potential links that are there. It's a very research intensive, very kind of energetic environments of scholarship, and that's really the big attraction to me, that there's a lot of energy. It's irrepressible, you can't kind of stop it happening. There's a lot of pride in research and research quality. There are kind of a whole set of new things happening on top of these very strong established things. For example, you may have heard about the Gloria Steinem Chair in Feminism and Media, which we reached the 3 million target in June, and we are in the process of going into the next phase of finding someone to fill that chair. So I spend a bit of time hanging out with Gloria Steinem, which is always fun, talking about what kind of person would be ideal for that chair and so on, and that will appear at some point in the next 12 months or so. We have a new Institute of Digital Innovation and Social Work, Digital Innovation in Social Work, collaboratively established with the Social Work School. We were given a large chunk of money by the university to help build that up, and one of my beliefs is that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, higher education institutions will need to collaborate with one another rather than compete. You still compete a bit, but collaboration will be the real pathway to success. And I've tried to display that in the actions that I've done. This Digital Innovation in Social Work Institute is so new that it doesn't have a website or a director yet. It's got one appointment over in social work. We're still looking for the right person to lead it. But over your time here, you'll gradually see it build up to be a serious presence on campus. I emphasise collaboration. We are, of course, near neighbours of the Annenberg School of Communication, and again, that's one of the things places traditionally that there's seen as a bit of competition, who's best, who's worst, and so on. I've been working with the Dean of Annenberg on 2 or 3 joint projects actually, but one that's come into fruition very hot off the press this week. This is a centre spearheaded by Todd Wilson for Journalism and Media Studies on digital inequality and social change, looking at digital issues and the way local communities are held back or can develop according to the way in which their broadband availability, their mobile phone use and so on allows them to organise in particular ways or prevents them organising in particular ways. And this will be announced more formally when it's launched in January. But again, it's a partnership between our 2 schools, and we have a number of different qualities that we bring to the table to complement each other on that. I already mentioned a looming master's program in creative media and cultural industries. We're also working on another master's program broadly in the area of health and well-being. Communication, information will be in there somewhere. So that will be another exciting thing that starts to roll out probably in 12 months' time or a little bit later. So there's a lot going on. And I'm going to stop for questions or thoughts. Anything that you'd like to ask me about the school, about where we're going, about the issues? Not you, John. You can. I'll take that silence to be very K+. As us conversation analysts think, this is a display of satisfied knowledgeability. So there's no need to transform that any further. But really lovely to meet you all. I look forward to having one-on-one conversations with you in the course of the semester, to hanging out at various events and so on, to being here for a Phd Colloquium at some point. For now, welcome again to Rutgers. I'm sure that you will find your experience here wonderful, transformative, exciting, and today's just the start of that.
Yeah.
So welcome. I'm now going to exit and change into my more relaxed clothes.
Thank you. And as we're going, if you ever have any questions for Dean Potter, he's very accessible, or questions for me, I'm also very accessible. And I'm interested in getting people's input on things that you might like to see at Colloquium. So if you ever feel like, that'd be really great if we could just have a whole Colloquium dedicated to learning about this social work initiative, like we can organize that. I could bring some people from social work and see what's happening there. I could bring in some outside speakers. So let me know if you have ideas of things that you'd like to see in Colloquium, because I'm always looking for ideas to fill up the schedule and make sure we've got exciting things happening all the time. So without any further ado, we'll get into presenting some exciting research. I'm going to let John Perwick introduce our student who will be presenting her dissertation, so he can tell you a little bit more about her, okay? Thanks, John.
Thank you, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here. I have met most of you, but I am a professor in the media studies area of the PhD program. Although, like Dean Potter, I'm very interdisciplinary in my approach. I also have a lot of international interests, and it might be those 2 things that led me to become UN's dissertation advisor. It was a great pleasure working with her. She's a marvelous student. If you're looking for someone as a potential role model, she'd be somebody to probably talk to, get some good ideas and some good examples you'll see in her research, which is not only a timely and important subject, but one that really represents the kind of scholarship that can happen here at Sky. Really theoretically rich work, drawing on different theoretical models. In her case, center periphery, public sphere theory integrated with other perspectives, drawing on the literature, developing a rigorous methodology, and then bring it all together in your analysis and advancing, making a contribution to the field. So it was really a great pleasure to work with her, and I congratulate her. But also I want to mention, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Montague Kern. Montague Kern is one of our great professors who has recently retired, but despite that, she continued to serve on Yuan's committee and did that remotely, and it was wonderful to have her involvement. So Yuan, congratulations again. I look forward to your presentation today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, and I'm so glad to be the first presentation for this semester. I hope you will enjoy that and enjoy the whole study life in this semester. All right, so here, the title of my dissertation is a dynamic interplay theorizing the relationship between online activism and government control in China. So I can use this way.
Is it connected?
Okay, well, stay here. You can try. Stay here. So, why is study? There's a little bit background. The internet was introduced to the Chinese public in 1994 by the Chinese government as a basic infrastructure of economic development. And after that, you can see the figure. This one figure. You will see the public user of the internet expanded rapidly from 1997 to 2012. Actually, by the end of 2012, the number of internet users already composed half of the total population in China. And absolutely, right now China has the largest number of internet users in the world. So, in this background, the question emerged naturally that people will ask, what could be the political impact of the internet use in such an authoritarian country? Here is a figure in the New York Times report on online activism events and the political dissidents in China from 2003 to 2012. New York Times has a tradition to report political dissidents of China that's rarely reported by domestic media. But from this figure, you will find that our interest in the online activism event has already become the prominent topic that was picked by New York Times in a report on Chinese politics. So, so in the conventional wisdom, the activism from the Golden Act, the relationship between the activism and the government in an authoritarian country is usually a opposing relationship. People believe that the government will repress the activism from the Golden Act, and in a very few cases, this activism will become a big revolution as it happened in North Africa and the Middle East. But both of these phenomena is not things we can observe from the case of China. In China, actually we observe that the growth of internet activism and the growth of government control took place at the same time. So, in this sense, I refer to this phenomenon as interactions in contentious politics. So, the study about Internet's role in politics actually went through different stages. For example, from the early blank optimistic to the later surveillance tours, the researchers nowadays moved beyond these early simplistic views. They started to explore the very specific role of Internet in the regarding their role in influence the political development in the different political systems. So the most dominant question asking about the internet use in authoritarian nations is whether the use of internet can promote or facilitate the democratization of the region. So the liberation and repression are two major perspectives to answer this question. And regarding the case of China, there's also an argument about change and control. The scholars who speak to the change view usually encouraged by the studies of successful cases and the survey data. They believe the democratic role of internet because they believe internet creates a new public sphere and also have a potential for generating mass mobilization. The studies of let's stick to the control view also are very fruitful because China has the most sophisticated censorship system in the world. Also, there's some studies also try to find the bottom line of Chinese government regarding their technology policies, and also they consider the Chinese government actually using the internet as a safety valve to relieve the social tensions. So either from the view perspective of change or from perspective of control, during this literature review, actually I found a common theme from the studies of both sides, because they both realize that the change the internet brought to China, it won't be a radical revolution. Instead, it's more like a gradual change. That was also very similar to the green zone theory that tries to describe a situation between the authoritarianism and the democracy. So after reading these studies, I'm trying to find an alternative way to explain the internet role in China, and using by focusing on the interaction between its resistance power and the control power. So my research question asked how the internet activism contend with the government control in the past 17 years. What are the government's response to this online activism, and why Chinese government and activists choose and change their strategies across issues and over time. In order to understand the logic basis of the online activism and the government response in China, I built my theoretical framework from two theories. The first one is the central periphery public sphere theory. That was first coined by Habermas and then later developed and redefined as common domain and the public sphere. So in this theory actually suggests an ideal situation that the new media of the internet can become a relatively independent media in a authoritarian country that not only build a free space for effective communication, but also can create a channel for this public opinion, marginalized public opinion to influence the decision-making process. And the second, I forgot to mention, if this model established in China, we should observe that the online activism agenda has been appeared in the government agenda. And the second theory is called the authoritarian deliberation theory. Actually, there is a bunch of theory that try to describe how this region is between the authoritarianism and the democracy, how they go through this transition. So this theory is a very new theory, and it's relatively new theory. It suggests that a deliberation process could be theoretically existent and functionally motivated in a certain state. So I use this theory here because it suggests the voice of the citizen online actually can generate broad deliberation among the different domains in the region. And this deliberation does not need to be only between the citizens. It can also between citizens and governments and the other agencies that connect on both sides. So, yeah. So, in this sense, my study use my case combination of case study and longitudinal study. Because case study is a preferred strategy when the phenomenon analyzed is a contemporary within a real-life context. And the longitudinal study allows a diachronic analysis of the incidence of conditions and events to study long-term effects. Because the analysis, the analysis because this study analyzed the case, individual cases, so we have to, there's an important thing when we do the data collecting that we need to keep the criteria for the case consistent. So the first step for the data collecting is to define what is the internet activism cases. And the second step is to build an internet activism index from 1994 to 2011. I also use different multi-level of the documents to build materials for each case. And the last one is to locating the official reports on each case from People's Daily. People's Daily is the largest party newspaper in China, is directly affiliated with the Communist Party. So finally, for this study, I collect 145 cases and 576 articles for my basic database. Okay, the next step is to do the data analyzing. The data analysis also has 3 steps. First is coding the activism cases based on the material I collected, and the second step is a topical agenda setting analysis and immediate learning analysis, and the third one is a comparative study of 2 cases. So here, the result of the coding tells us a lot of information, like the general information of the case, where it happened, how it happened, who involved, and in what time it happened. And also it also tells us what the strategies and the tactics the people used during the process. So here, before in terms of the numbers of accident case per year, we will see definitely it has an increasing every year, just except 2007. But maybe 2007 is the year before the Beijing Olympic Games, so the government has a more strict control of the internet that makes the case, make the accident case just go down a little bit, but then go back to the right track. And the second, figure there is about the distribution of the activity case in China. It's really interesting. We see the economic development area, for example, the province in the coastal area and the big cities like Beijing, they have more cases than the other areas. This is not the purpose of my study, but I think this provides some evidence about the relationship between the between the social movement and the economic development in the authoritarian countries. I think I missed one part here, but there's also this tell what kind of cause could be the major cause of the activism that happened. For example, the human rights, the activism about human rights, and the environmental issues, and the food safety, the land dispute, and the nationalism. This is the 5 major causes of the Chinese internet activism. So actually, Chinese internet activism has diverse topics. With these diverse topics, the strategy and the tactics used in each activism were also varied. presenting here, but that's why I talk about that. During my coding process, I built from that there's many activism cases that share strategies. People use the similar tactics, and also they form some kind of the pattern, some pattern of the actions that can form the repertoires. Repertoires means that several cases they formed a series of the actions that can make them maybe more make a movement more effective and create more pressures to the target. So in these studies, I summarized 9 repertoires and 3 major tactics. And the development of the repertoires in Chinese internet activism actually reflected first the Chinese internet users adopted different ways, and they keep learning from the previous cases and developing new ways, and making very flexibility of their resistance to the government. And during this process, they also formed a periphery public sphere. And there's also three factors that can influence the development of Chinese internet activism. The first one is the emergence of the new technology, and the second one is the citizens' awareness of their rights, and the third one is just their interaction with the government. So,
do you want to try the keyboard? If you pull out the drawer that's underneath, and you hit enter,
this is not a
It's probably just something
Something with the
with
mouse.
the system, so
Yeah.
I would just play it from that slide.
Yeah.
That would be okay.
Okay, that's what I mentioned, the popular causes of internet activism in China. And this is I mentioned the 9 repertoires and the 3 tactics from my coding of the data. And also there are 3 factors that influence the development of activism. First, the last one I feel like is very important in interaction with the government. So here, the second step of my data analysis is to find the agenda setting effect of this online activism. The first figure details the percentage of activism cases reported by People's Daily, the party's newspaper, each year from 2000 to 2011. And we can also see a growth trend here. And the second figure is about the growth rate of the different kind of the articles in the People's Daily. There's 3 kinds of articles reporting on the activism case. One is the issue-centered, second one is the discussion-centered, and the third one is internet-centered. The issue-centered is just mention the event, the activism incident, and simply tell the outcomes. And the discussion focus is they discuss about why it happened and how it happened and what's the policy problem. Actually, they echoed what the netizens discussed online about this activism. And the internet-centered is like the government just focus on the role of internet, and they comment on the activist strategy during these activism cases. So the major finding of this part is one. First is I did find a bottom-up agenda setting effect from the Chinese online activism to the newspaper, to the public, to the political agenda represented by the party media. It's nearly half of the activism cases have the report on the official media. And also, I found that this agenda setting effect developed from the issue level to the activity level. from the figure of the growth after second figure. So together with the development, the efforts of the online activists, it's also found very interesting thing the change of the government's attitude. The next one. So this one you can see. I compare the evolution of the activism vectors and to the official newspaper's attitude on the timeline. So you can see very obviously about the first is the official newspaper first. There's no report on online activism, and they just select something to promote their own image, and then report on activism cases only about the issues, and also report on activism started to discuss the underlying causes and mention the internet distractions. So from 1994 to 2006, we can see the ignorance to selective report, the change from ignorance to selective report. And from 2006, the government started to change the framing of the internet, the role of internet. They first just emphasized the downside of internet activism, and then 2008 is a turning point. They say that online activism was named as citizen participation, and they call for a healthy interaction between citizens and the government. After 2009, the government also started a campaign to ask for more involvement of the different level of the government officers. They asked them to open accounts in social media, asked them to have conversation with the activists, and so in other words, their focus changed to the internet management, and they call their strategy as the combination of the supervision and the use. So the third step of my data analysis is a comparative studies of two cases. The Taishi case in 2005 and the Wuhan activism in 2011. These two cases are two village-based activism cases against the land sale, category correction and result of elections. They asked for democratic election in the local level. These two villages have very similar geographic location, and they have a very similar economic background. And also both cases started with the same petitions and demonstrations of the villages, and they both requested by the local government at the first time. But after that, the development they went to the different directions. The first case failed. The villages, their petitions were followed by the local government. And the second one, they successfully have a democratic election at their request. The officials have been removed, and they have their own leaders. So what factors make these different results? First, I found if we compare the two cases, first they have different way of the forming of activism sphere. In the first one, the activism sphere is formed by outside activists, like a group of journalists, rights activists, scholars, and rights lawyers. And in the later one, the activism sphere actually formed by the villages themselves as an extension of the voluntary organization. So from the very beginning, you can see they have used different strategies. In the Taishi case, these outside activists, they try to frame this activism case as a part of a larger political reform in China. They want to use it just like a starting, like a big start point to a nationwide political reform. But in Wuhan case, the villages stick to their own interests. They frame that they're against the local government, but repeatedly restate their they're still, they believe the central government there will consistent with the party. So, and also there is the involvement of the mass media, different level of mass media, including local media, independent media, and also foreign media. This is the factor that makes a difference. And the last one is the political opportunity, as very importantly. They always have a opportunity available for the activists, but if you can take advantage of it, you will make your case more possibility to be successful. So in the later case, the Wuhan people, they actually take advantage of the gap between the central government and the local government, and to make it a very strong strategy for their case. This is the result of the comparative, but from these two cases that happened in different area, different time frame. Actually, I built the ecosystem of Chinese internet activism. So this is I try to use this diagram to illustrate the negotiation process between the Chinese online activism and the government. So you will see there's a lot of agencies between them. With the help of the media professionals, the NGOs, the rights activists, the scholars, and the legal professionals, this online activism can successfully build a very independent studies there and against the government. And also, because of the existence of the media professionals, the NGOs, and the rights agencies, it buffers the conflict between the grassroots activism and also with the central government. And the local government is a very interesting thing here in China's case. It's like the central government actually also use the internet activism to level their relationship with the local government, and also to use this internet activism to stimulate some immediately transformation. What does this a lot of studies mean? There's several things, key issues that I'd like to conclude here. There's three filters of Chinese internet activism that I summarize as first is the flexibility regarding the force and the contents, constant networking building of all social status, and self-adjustment function as collective intelligence are all their leverage in contending and negotiating with the government. It's not like the case itself has the power, as the accumulated power they are forming during this process, and the networking and these features make them become a very threat to the authoritarian government. And the second, the negotiations result in deliberations in multi-level domains among different social actors, interested third parties, and government, which form the ecosystem of Chinese internet activism, and the dynamic balance between the grassroots activism and the state. So there's two meanings of this dynamic. The first is the uncertainty in individual cases, that you never know in one case who will be involved. I mean, the agencies between this ecosystem, and how deep they were involved, in what way they were involved. And the second meaning is this is always a temporary balance. That means it will be very easy broken by the emergence of new technologies and by the new incidents, and also even the change of the economic development. The last one is actually I found the Chinese government and activists, they both have taken advantage of this structure to achieve their objectives. So in this sense, I would suggest existing but unstable collaboration actually formed between international activism and the authoritarian government after this year's interaction as the result. Here is the limitations of my study. The major limitation of my study is time frame limitation. I just examined the accident cases happened from 1994 to 2011. It has 7 years has passed, so things may change. And the major reason is very important because there's a change in leadership in China in 2012. And there also the rise of WeChat is a cell phone-based social media application already taking place on the microblog in China. So it may be generate new forms and new strategies by the internet activists. And they also always have a selection bias in data collections because it largely relies on the reported and the secondary materials. And also, after 2012, the internet governing has been encouraged by the Chinese government. Now it's becoming a very important skill by the Chinese officers. So we need to consider it as a component in this ecosystem. So the first user studies may first extend my time frame for the studies and try to avoid the data the selection files and also add internet gathering. And after that, I think I may need to take a cross-nation studies to compare these topics in different authoritarian countries to build a maybe more comprehensive theories to this area. So that's it. Any questions?
So I'm assuming that your data sets were in Chinese, right? And so my question is about, and your dissertation is in English. At what point do you translate? Is it, do you code? Did you code in Chinese and then translate your codes, or did you translate your data and then code in English, and why?
Yeah, I coded in Chinese absolutely, but I translated the result in English. I made a coding book in both Chinese and I think I made a coding book like in English, but when I'm doing coding, I translate it in Chinese because there's a lot of the materials and maybe I think maybe I'm already used to this way to study like translate between the English and the Chinese. So I didn't feel like there's a big burden there when do I translate there. Yeah, and also the coding book is very clearly. For example, the question asked very clearly. There's where did it happen, and who is the initiator, and who is the target. And so I think that your question may be depending on what kind of issues you are coding, right? So for me, I didn't feel there's a translated problem during this process. But if you are thinking there's something maybe I didn't realize, that you can let me know, and I will think about maybe that's another limitation of my studies.
Well, I only speak English, so I have no idea if that's an issue. So I was just wondering if there was any type of issue with translation.
Yes.
Also, China is such a big country, and if you're getting data from different parts of the country, do dialects matter? Because you are looking at newspaper, but it's one newspaper. So I was just wondering about how language fit into this.
You mean the People's Daily, or you mean the New York Times, or which newspaper you're talking about?
Yeah, so the People's Daily, right, it's the same newspaper. Yeah, and so that was all in the same type of language. But I was just wondering if you thought about how language fit into this, because you are taking something that happened in Chinese and reporting on it in English. I was just wondering in general.
Yeah, mostly I analyze the data and analyze it based on the Chinese language, and when I report it, I translate it in English. Yes, I think the translation maybe has some limitations if you're translating something there already have ambiguous meanings. there's always some kind of words there, but it's not the problem of the study. I think that's a good question. Think about it.
It might be more of another limitation of a doctoral program. We need to embrace other languages publication. It's a good point.
Yeah, very good.
I'm just curious, so you're from China, and you're studying the cases in China.
Yes.
As a native Chinese, how did that influence your coding and interpretation as you're engaging with the study? Anything that might come as surprising to the non-native Chinese that might have been just taken for granted to you as a Chinese? And
Yeah, I think you're asking a good question that can be accompanied with you through all the research. Your research in life, if you are doing the research on the foreign places. Sometimes I always find, for me, my first question is like, if as a Chinese, I'm doing the coding of the Chinese case. I think the advantage is that I'm very familiar with that. So I know the language, I'm familiar with these things, so I can get the things exactly and quickly. But the disadvantage is like maybe I have my bias. Yeah, sometimes my focus is different from the other folks like Dr. John. They have and that's the case. Every time when I talk my dissertation or give my dissertation to professor after reading, they always find something very interesting that I never think about it. It's like, yeah, so it depends on your position, yeah, of course. But what the research can do is like to just reduce the problem that's brought by your position to the very limit.
Right, it's a good question, and it raises the larger issue of what all scholars have to address. They're most U.S. scholars study the U.S., so they have the exact same problem. They have their own cultural parameters that limit the lens that they can bring to it. And it's true for every scholar in any part of the world. If they're studying their own native culture, they have that same problem.
Right.
You can only step out of it when you study another culture. That's one of the reasons that I do a lot of my work studying other cultures. But then you also have problems because you're coming at it from the U.S. point of view. So these things are very complicated, and you have being aware of it is really helpful.
Right. So I don't know if you are doing the study on your country if you are not from the U.S., but I think you will struggle about that because I'm doing the literature review, and I also read the English literature review and also the Chinese literature review, and also read the Chinese scholars in English in United they write English review. They can find very different positions there, and a common thing there, they are struggling to find something specific. Was different from the Western views. They think the culture, because the different cultures from different political systems, maybe the Western view cannot be like enough to explain something happened in China or in other countries. So you are struggling with this problem questions all the way. But you think about that as the first time, that's a good start. Very good.
I have a broader question. So you stopped, your data set in 2011, and so since then, here in the United States, we've seen a lot of online activism in response to the presidential election. We've also been learning more about foreign influence in our online activism and our online news. Facebook, selling advertising to Russian sources and fake accounts and whatnot. And so your data probably doesn't speak to it, but I'm wondering, just based on your own observations of what's happening in China, if there are similar kinds of influences that are influencing online activism in the culture now, as an outside observer.
It's like, yeah, it's the first thing in my brain is like, different stories. Sometimes I think a lot of things brought in the U.S. That's very interesting because when I talking to students, she asked the same, not same, but very similar question. She really wants to know if these things happen in the U.S. have influence in China. I think, and also have influence in this the academic cases is they're actually learning internationally from the outside sources. I see they know Chinese nations, they have access to international news, and anything is not good in U.S. The Chinese government worries for them. So, so don't worry, they know that. But I didn't really see very significant of their way they're learning or they're saying, I need to adopt this way. I think this is a good thing like from the US things that we need to use in our strategies. I really didn't see this kind of discussions. So I think the Chinese clearly realize what they're against is totally different government from the American government. They cannot use the same thing. And regarding other things like the rumors, things like after the American election, to me it's very familiar because the rumor is a very, I don't know if it's very, it actually sometimes dominates tactic used by Chinese citizens. We sometimes conclude that maybe because the Chinese government, they do not have the people do not believe the government, so the rumors that just spread so widely. So that's after the American election, I think, oh my, there's also rumors in the U.S. Yeah, and it's just like it's not like so it's like China not everything following the U.S. But sometimes U.S. is sometimes something following China. Yeah, it's kind of separate cases, and they still have something like maybe have some underlying connections. What people think about, because people have a similar similar way to think and to behave.
Any other questions?
Alright, well, thank you. On behalf of the PhD program, we would just like to congratulate you and give you a small gift to remember us by. So good luck to you as you finish your degree and move on to great things.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Joy Cobb, who's going to be presenting on her dissertation proposal. And her advisor, Bernadette Gallier, can't be here today, so I'll just say welcome to Joy. Is that supposed to wait? No, you can come out. Joy's been doing some great work with Bernadette and has been active in conferences and presenting papers in various places, so I'm looking forward to hearing where her dissertation is going to take her, so I'll turn the floor over to you.
Yay! Okay. So today we're going to, the whole thing is about activism, which is fun. All right. Can I just adjust this now? All right. So some of our presentation also has to deal with activism, but we're switching gears a little bit as far as the topic is. And so, there we go. All right. So I actually defended my proposal on Tuesday. So hold your applause. So I'll see how much brain matter I have left. I actually met with Bernadette before this, right? So there's been a lot of stretching and pulling. There's some things that we're working through as far as kind of finalizing my ideas and my plans. But just to kind of give you guys what I have today, I'm presenting to you my dissertation proposal, which is entitled A Seat at the Table, a Case Study of the Fat Liberation Movement, Identity, and Political Action. Okay, and so, my study objectives, I kind of want to lay these out ahead of time because there's a lot of literature that I cover. I don't know how I managed to pull a committee member from every department in the school, but I did it. And so on my committee is Dr. Bernadette, she's my advisor. Marie is on my committee, she's from LIS. Todd Wilson is on my committee, he's from media. And then Professor Jocelyn Crowley is on my committee, and she's actually from the Blaustein School in Public Policy. And so I'm trying to work all of these things together. And so my study objective, first and foremost, is to provide a voice and visibility to a movement and social cause that has been long overlooked by society. And we'll kind of get into this as my study goes on, and I'll kind of talk about the history of fat liberation and how long they've been around, and surprisingly how many people have no idea that they exist. In addition to that, I'm also hoping to provide practical feedback on how what causes and social movements, provide practical feedback. What I'm going to do is I'm going to provide practical feedback on how social movements thrive or how they also can be hindered. So kind of what the causes are, what may be the factors in that. And then last but not least, I'm hoping to merge the disciplines of social movement research, communication, and public policy to kind of give a comprehensive look at the fat liberation movement, solidifying its existence and examining the hindrances and the advances to its involvement. And so kind of from a personal standpoint, me personally, why I kind of want to look at this, being a chunky monkey myself, I think about these things, right? Like, what are the implications of fat shaming and weight stigma, right? And I wonder to myself oftentimes why a movement like the fat liberation movement doesn't have as much exposure as these other things, right? And like I said, they've been around for quite a long time that I'll kind of get into. And so if they've been around for as long as they have, I also wonder why they're not being heard, right? Why they aren't making advances. How come we don't know about them? How come we don't talk about them? You know, and then in a more roundabout way, right? How in some ways we as the public can be better humans, right? When we are encountering individuals who don't look like us, right? And so hopefully my study will kind of add to some literature that's already out there and kind of create a lane in the path for individuals to have this type of inspiration who want to look at marginalized groups and populations for so that it can add to what we already have in academia, because there's more than enough information and studies in academia about how people who are of larger sizes are depressed and they're not happy and they're never going to be happy, right? And they face so much discrimination and all of these other things. And as someone who has experienced, I mean, I've never been a smaller person. So someone who kind of has lived this life firsthand, we do smile, right? we do have fun. Our life doesn't always consist of like horrible things, right? And sometimes being in academia, in a lot of ways, it saddens me to know that there's not anything that's documented in that area when it comes to individuals who are living their lives, and then also understanding that it could absolutely be a possibility and be a reality. Okay. So, moving on, right? One of the biggest questions, kind of tackling, understanding, and identifying this question, this idea, right? Like, what is fat? And I say that because when we are looking at fat, even when you say it in a general sense, fat tends to carry a very negative connotation along with it, right? So if I stand up here and I say I'm a fat woman, people are like, what? You're not fat, right? Like, no, you're voluptuous, you're curvy, you're this, but not fat. Like, don't use the word fat, right? And so what we find, particularly in literature, is that fat is often used as a descriptive word until we're talking about the size of bodies. Once we start talking about the size of bodies, then we have this issue of negative connotations emerging, right? And so throughout my study, what I found in a lot of ways is that when we look at fat in literature, we find that fat equals unhealthy, right? So that's the first thing. If you're fat, if you have a larger body, you have to be unhealthy. Just the way the life works, right? Those are the things that we've been taught over time, right? And so during the process of me doing this study, I found that there was actually a case that was brought against a corporation in Texas where a woman sued the corporation because the doctor, she went in, she had an examination done, Everything came back, blood work came back good, she passed her physical, but the doctor refused to give her a certificate that would allow her to pass her health examination because he said that she waddled when she walked, right? And it took her too long to get to his office. Therefore, she did not qualify, okay, to work for employment, right? So what we find here, right, is that people who are larger in size are ultimately being judged. You know, nobody knows. You could have, you could have other things going on in your body, right? One leg could be shorter than the other. Nobody knows, right? But if I put that on your body size and I say, well, because you're larger in frame, right, you can't possibly, you're unhealthy. You're unfit to work, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that fat equals unprofessional, right? And so in a study conducted by Trethewey, women from the Chamber of Commerce revealed that women with fat bodies can't be professional, right? It shows a lack of self-control. A few years ago, there was a doctor, a professor that was on Twitter that came under fire because he said he wouldn't accept a fat PhD student into his program because if the PhD student didn't have enough self-control to regulate their own body, how would they ever get through a program, right? And so we have these instances, right, that fat no longer is just this thing of description, but fat now also carries meanings. And I'll give you one more just for good pleasure. That's what we're doing here today, right? So then the last and final thing that I kind of want to touch on is that fat equals personal failure. And I think this type of discourse is one that we come in contact with often, right? So you may not hear it in the professional sector that someone who's larger in size is unprofessional. You may not hear that someone who's larger in size is unhealthy, but I doubt it. You've probably heard that. The last and final thing that we deal with is that fat equals personal failure. So whether it's Weight Watchers, whether it's The Biggest Loser, whether it's My 600-Pound Life, right? What we're finding is that individuals constantly equate weight loss to this sense of you having willpower to do it, right? And so never mind genetics, right? We're not talking about genetics. I have two sisters. I guess part of doing studies like this is like you wind up talking way too much about yourself. But I have two sisters. One of them's younger than me, one of them's older, so I'm smack dab in the middle. Me and my sister, we had a conversation one day, and she asked me, I guess like sisters do, why do you think you turned out the way you did, right? Like, why do you think your body is the way that it is? And I said, well, when, you and my sister, I have a sister named April, one name is Dawn. I said, well, when you and April hit puberty, y'all got taller. I have a sister, she's 5'9", and the other one's like 5'11". I'm 5'4.5". I said, when I hit puberty, my hips spread. I had no control over that, right? There wasn't anything that I could do about that. But if I'm looking at my weight gain as this sense of personal failure, if I'm looking at my, the size of my body, something that in some ways genetics is a big determinant in the weight that you carry, where it goes, where it distributes, but oftentimes we find that weight loss discourse, right? And discourse in the media is kind of surrounded around this idea of you being able to do it. Calories in, calories out. If you burn it off, if you work hard enough, you should be able to drop weight, right? And we can talk about the percentage of how diets fail and all that stuff afterwards. It's not part of my study. I'll move on because I know, time is of the essence, okay? And so, based on these factors, even though those studies were kind of done more recently, obviously the fat liberation movement was developed around these ideas. So these ideas have been around for a very long time. And the fat liberation movement was developed for fat individuals who seek freedom from societal norms and discrimination practices. And so what most people don't know is that the fat liberation movement was created in the 60s, during the same time as the civil rights movement. Okay, so we're talking about a movement that's been around for roughly 4 decades, right? 40 some odd years. We're talking where a lot of people are like, huh? Like, fat liberation movement, when? Who created it? And so it's been around for a long time. And what I wanted to seek to do in my proposal was to kind of solidify its existence, right? Before we ever move further, in the study, I wanted to kind of make the argument that it's been around for a while. Not only has it been around for a while, but it's also been comprised of 3 waves. So much like that of feminism, okay? And so in the first wave, the fat liberation movement was really about legitimacy. It was about making the name or the movement of fat liberation something that was official, right? So communities were grafted. The first organization, national organization, was created, which was known as NAFA, right? Which is the NAAFA, which is patterned after the NAACP. And it was actually created by a man because he seen the mistreatment that his wife received. So he said, listen, we got to do something about this, start something for people. The actual first fat-in, so they called it a fat-in, so like sit-ins, protests, things of that nature, was actually done in Central Park in New York City. And it incorporated people who were eating ice cream, burning pictures of Twiggy, and burning diet books. Right? And so they started out, you know, I'm pretty sure in the 60s that was radical, right? Like, why are these people eating ice cream and burning pictures? What's going on? So that was pretty much the first wave of the fat liberation movement. And that kind of ranged between the years of the 60s through the 70s. Right? Through the 80s up until the late 90s, you have what we call the second wave of the fat liberation movement. And that focused more on expansion, right? So now you have fat liberation passing outside of the United States, right? We're spreading over into areas of Canada. We're pulling people from the United Kingdom. We're talking about fat liberation in ways that we hadn't talked about previously. In addition to that, you also have things happening like there's more books being written, there's more articles being written, right? People are publishing information, exposing the medical industry, so to speak, on how we talk about dieting, how we talk about our bodies. In addition to that, you also have activists creating their own media, right? And so through the platform, I'm sure people have heard of zines before, right? So they're putting together zines. We're creating our own media, art, plays, all of those types of things that kind of show fat people in a different light. We also have the inclusion of spokespersons, celebrities. So I don't know if anybody in the room is old enough to remember Ricky Lake. Do you remember Ricky Lake? Okay, and the Ricky Lake show. So who you see Ricky Lake as today is not who she was in the 90s. Ricky Lake actually used to be a very large woman, but seeing her in a different position than what you would typically see fat individuals. So she had her own talk show, and she was able to talk about the struggles that she had and that she faced with her own weight. Carnie Wilson is another individual, right? So she's a singer. I believe she was in Wilson Phillips. And she also was able to kind of have a platform to talk about her own weight in that respect. Later on, what we do know is that both Ricky Lake and Carnie Wilson have gone on to have weight loss surgery. And I think Carnie Wilson actually had weight loss surgery twice, right? So again, when we talk about these issues of failing diets and how surgery does not necessarily fix everything, these are things that we need to talk about. But the second wave, nevertheless, focused on expansion. This is what we're kind of dealing with in that. And then also something that we know more so when we talk about the second wave is what we now know today as plus size clothing, right? And so during this time in history, this is when you have individuals creating, corporations looked over and said, oh, well, I think, fat people are good for business. So let's mass produce shirts with big flowers on them. Right? Floral everything. Whatever we can stick a flower on, that's what we're going to do. But corporations see in a way to profit off of larger bodies. And so you see this mass production of clothing and different things like that. And what we now know today as plus size fashion happens during the second wave of fat liberation. Right? And so that's great, that's wonderful. And then towards the new millennium, into the year of 2000, we have what is known as the third wave of fat liberation. And that's kind of where we are today. And oddly enough, similar to the third wave of feminism, we have the same issues in fat liberation that we have in feminism, right? And so individuals begin to cry out and they say, we're not being represented, right? What fat liberation is to you as predominantly white women and middle class is not to, African Americans who live in lower incomes. It's not the same for individuals who deal with disabilities. It's not the same for individuals who deal with anything outside of cisgender, right? And so now there's a push and there's an argument for fat liberation movements to become more inclusive. The coined lovely phrase that we all love to use today, intersectionality, right? We need it, we gotta have it. And as a result, there's a shock and there's a shaking that happens within the movement. And so what we see is that individuals start to lead these national organizations for smaller communities, right? These communities that kind of cater to their needs, right? And so I'm going to be a part of, there's a Tumblr site, I believe, that's called Women of Color, right? So instead of me being part of NAFA, I'm now part of Women of Color, right? Because they kind of supply a need for me that I didn't have before. There's also a national organization, national organizations grow during this wave, but there's a national organization called No Lose that actually caters to individuals in the LGBTQ community. And so fat liberation is in the process of kind of restructuring itself in a way so that it caters to everyone, and not just the majority. Okay? All right, so that's what we have about fat liberation, okay? And so in my proposal, like I said, what I wanted to do was kind of solidify the existence of that and then start to think in some ways and around how fat liberation fits into issues of social movements, because we know it's there, right? So I'm reading over this literature and I'm like, yeah, this very much sounds like a social movement to me, right? But we know that nothing is proven until you can find it in literature. So I was like, I gotta find information on that, and then in addition to that, obviously, if you ask me, weight stigma, fat shaming, all of that sounds like a communication problem to me. And so I knew that there was literature I could find in communication. And then last but not least, dealing with social change and political action. I knew that there would be something that I could connect in that literature in regards to fat liberation. And so what kind of led me on with a journey as far as social movements were concerned, that deal with the kind of the history of social movements. And we know that, well, I guess, since the 19th century, social movement research has been of interest to both psychologists and sociologists, hoping to understand better how collective identities form and how these identities kind of lead to collective behaviors, right? And so I think I started at the late 1700s, moving into the early 1800s when I started looking at my research. But one thing that caught my mind more so than anything else, well, two things in particular, is that both social movement literature, communication literature, and public policy literature on political action, what I found is that everybody kind of talks about the same things, they just have different names for them. So there was times when I was reading, I said, it's all the same. But kind of finding out the meanings behind each one. And so what sticks out to me primarily in the context of fat liberation is what is known as new social movement theory. And now there's a lot of controversy around new social movement theory, if it's really a theory or not, what type of framework it is, etc. But as I read about this, there were some things that I found that kind of resonated with me in regards to the way in which fat liberation as a movement works. Okay, and so Carnie posits that new social movements as a collective identity of those who experience both class and identity struggles. And I think pulling back from the literature and fat liberation, right, fat liberation is all about identity, right? As we move into the third wave of fat liberation, we can argue that it's also about class, right? And it's not necessarily to say that issues of race or these other more structured identities don't matter, because we know that they do. But it's to say that people are now coming together for other reasons, right? And the argument around new social movement theory is that there's more of an issue of identity formation that's happening. There's more of this issue of like having concerns about morality and what really matters, right? And doing the right thing and treating everybody the way that we're supposed to be treating them, that people are gathering together. In addition to that, new social movement also has this this addition of new technology, right, and the impact that new technology has on the ways in which individuals disseminate information. And so within the fat liberation movement, there is something that's called the fatosphere, right? And what that is that it's a network of individuals on the internet. The Fatosphere also consists of like an email mailing list, where it's pretty much a resource for fat individuals and living. So if you need to find new clothes, you can go to the Fatosphere and find out, right? If you're having a hard time at work, somebody said something, you don't know how to deal with it, go to the Fatosphere, right? You can get daily emails every day from the Fatosphere telling you about the new things that are happening, the new things that are in the news, right? And so that kind of serves as a way to educate individuals on what's happening in the fat community and the things that they should be concerned about. In addition to that, new technology also enables us, again, to connect across countries and across cultures to talk about some of the common problems that we see in cultures, right? And so being a part of this type of community for a while, there's people in the Middle East who want to talk about how to kind of develop a fat positive type of framework for the women and where they are. People in Africa, I went to Full Figure Fashion Week, I did an observation there. People traveled all the way from Nigeria. I was surprised to see. Really? For this? Okay. So what we know is that the message of fat liberation, this message of fat acceptance and fat positivity is spreading. And part of the ways in which it's spreading is by ways of new technology. And so what I used in my proposal was that I used this literature on social movements to kind of, again, solidify the fact that not only has fat liberation existed, but it also fits within the framework of a social movement, right? So we can kind of stop talking about it like it's a blip in history. We can kind of stop talking about it like, oh, some people just decided to get together one day. Like, no, we can actually solidify it as a history throughout the past 4 decades and the work that's been done by activists near and far. Okay? And so that kind of leads me to the literature on identity. And so this is kind of like my bread and butter, I guess, being an OrCon. So identity and identification processes have been central constructs of study in communication discipline for decades. Most of that, though, has kind of revolved around cognitive approaches. So when we're talking about social identity theory and also talking about social categorization theory, a lot of that deals with kind of the social-psychological aspects of individuals. What am I thinking, right? And how that kind of plays a part in how they identify with groups, how they disidentify with groups, and how they interact with one another. The problem with that is that there's typically a blind spot when we talk about cognitive approaches because it doesn't really take an assessment of the ways in which communication, actual words, verbal communication plays a part in how individuals are shaping and forming their identities. And so what I'm personally interested in is the discursive approach to identity, right? I want to know about the identification processes that people have. And so identification could be defined as an ongoing process that individuals go through to define themselves and communicate with others. And so what we see is through a social constructionist type framework here or perspective is that identification, what we're saying is that happens between this interaction between individuals, right? And so it's the discourse, it's the type of things that you talk about, whether it be the dominant discourse that plays a part in local talk, so the talk that I may have between someone else in this room, or if we're talking about bigger discourses, right? When we talk about issues like weight loss discourse, or we're talking about, you know, fat-phobic discourse in some ways, right? And so I'm more interested in how these big dominant discourses are playing a part in the little discourses that we have, right? Or how these big dominant discourses are playing a part in the ways that individuals identify within organizations or within the movement. Kind of summed up that slide coming next year, all right? All right. And so last but not least, right? So after we kind of talk about identification, the movement has been solidified. The last thing I want to talk about today is the relevant literature on political action, right? And so like I said earlier today, social change is the goal of the movement. And so political action can be defined as behaviors utilized by individuals or groups to influence political power within the sphere of politics. right? And so this can be a number of different behaviors. These political practices and actions can also be institutionalized or uninstitutionalized. So when we're talking about institutionalized political action, we're talking about you going out and voting, right? You doing your civic duty, signing up for petitions, things of that nature. When we talk about uninstitutionalized political action, we're talking about protests. We're talking about, you know, in the case of fat liberation, we're talking about people going on beaches and wearing two-piece bathing suits and, you know, allowing their bodies, in some ways, I should not say a spectacle, but allowing their bodies to be super visible in an attempt to kind of have people pay attention to what's going on around them. And so throughout my research, what I found is that typically members of marginalized groups actually participate in uninstitutionalized actions, right? And you can kind of see that throughout the history of the fat liberation movement. We have these fat-ins, we have individuals who are taking these big steps to make themselves visible, people who are constantly pushing back against what societal norms would dictate to us that bodies are supposed to be like. But something that I found that was really interesting in my process of kind of looking around and being kept up with current events is that during the healthcare issue this year, there were a lot of people on a lot of platforms within fat positive communities and fat liberation that began to kind of change their approach a little bit, right? Because we could, or I shouldn't say we, but they couldn't afford to have a healthcare bill passed that would see their bodies as a pre-existing condition, right? And so you had individuals within these groups saying, hey, call your local senators, write letters, right? This institutionalized political action, get moving, make a change so that we don't find ourselves on the outskirts looking in whenever it comes to the essentials that we need for living. Okay? And so, in the realm of public policy, institutionalized practices are stifled due to social constructions of groups, right? And so this kind of speaks to my last point, right? Some of the reasons why things don't get done as far as fat liberation is concerned, at least in this country, is because there is a social construction of groups. And it falls in public policy when we are talking about who's deserving of goods, who's deserving of resources, right? And a lot of this deals with issues of how you see fat people, how you see, you know, if the government be fat phobic, if we believe everything that comes out of the medical community in regards to, you know, who can lose weight, who can't lose weight, this is the right way to be, this is the only way to be, it's very hard to get public policy passed. Extremely hard. And so during the process of my research, what I found is that one of the things that kind of work against the fat liberation movement or work against fat liberation is this employment of policy entrepreneurs, right? And policy entrepreneurs can be anybody within the public policy domain who kind of can fight for or against particular topics that wind up on the policy floor, right? And so if you have policy entrepreneurs that belong within the medical community, they have enough resources, they have enough money, and they have enough networks to argue and actively fight against liberation for individuals who are upsized. One of the ways to mitigate this, through research, I also found is something what's called the advocacy coalition framework, and that's when activists kind of couple with public policy, I don't want to call them experts, but individuals who are involved in public policy and kind of find an umbrella to get under, right? So if we know that fat liberation is like one of those, you know, like Instagram has those banned hashtags, like you don't want to go in under the name of fat liberation or the label of fat liberation, you might be able to find some shelter under the umbrella of women's rights. Right? You may be able to find some shelter under anti-bullying type of situations, coalitions, and things of that nature. And so a way to kind of mitigate this looking forward may be for fat liberation groups, fat liberation, the movement as a whole, to find some type of shelter under these other organizations or these other contexts so that they can actually get what they need. All right. So that was my literature review. I'm sorry, it's long. My apologies. Okay. So this kind of leads me to my research questions. And so my overarching research question is, what are the barriers and facilitators to the progression in the fat liberation movement? Right? So again, we have fat liberation in social movements, we have fat liberation in reasons of communication, we have fat liberation active in political action. So there has to be something, right, that's stopping them from either moving forward, right, or allowing them to advance. These things get kind of murky when you look at the history of fat liberation, and so these are things that I would like to have answers to. My first research question is, how do identity and identification processes impact the fat liberation movement? I'm also interested in how institutionalized and uninstitutionalized political actions impact the fat liberation movement, and then how do the tensions between big D and little d discourse impact the fat liberation movement? And so I'm hoping through my methods I'll be able to accomplish this goal. And what I'm proposing for my methods is to first do a discourse analysis, particularly a thematic analysis, looking at blog posts, TV shows, social media posts, and pictures that kind of coincide with these articles from both a pro and anti-fat perspective. I'm also interested in looking at the things that kind of hinder, and particularly that hinder fat liberation. And so that's body positive discourse, because believe it or not, they are not the same. Weight loss discourse, anti-fat discourse. I'm also interested in critical incidents, particularly critical incidents that have happened over the past 1 to 3 years. And so within the movement, there's been a lot of shaking and moving, like I said before, things that kind of impact how we identify with the movement, and then also the ways in which the public kind of views the movement as a whole. And so I think it would be extremely interesting to kind of look at those things, particularly, like I said, the healthcare issue that happened within the movement. There's been a few individuals who were seen as representatives of the movement who went and got weight loss surgery. So there was a lot of talk and chatter in the movement about those things. And I think that that would kind of add to the meat of my study. And then once I'm able to kind of map the discourse analysis, I'd like to move on to interviews and conduct interviews and have perspectives from members in the movement. Again, also them recalling critical incidents that have happened, also possible internal disruption, right? So the issues of disidentification, what makes you disidentify from a movement or from an organization or a committee or community for that matter. I would like to know. I'm interested in kind of interviewing new and old members. So members that have been around for quite a long time. William Fabre is the individual who actually created the NFFA, and I've been on threads with him, chat threads. So kind of having access to the community, I think, would be helpful in understanding this. I'm hoping to conduct 20 to 30 interviews and kind of, you know, come up with a thematic analysis by using open and axial coding after I conduct the interviews. See, my tongue is running out of, yeah, that's okay. And so some theoretical and practical implications for my study. Obviously, I hope to extend the work being done in social movement research, communication, and public policy, and I feel like this proposal will do that. In addition to that, I hope to elaborate on the discourse approach in communication research, as there has been work that's been done on that, and I think it's growing, but you know, you never can have too much. I also would like to provide practical solutions and suggestions to social movements based on the results of the study. So I'm hoping that my work does not just rest in academia, but that individuals will be able to use this and strategize around the ideas of what you know, what you can do that would be beneficial, and also things that you want to kind of stay away from. I'm hoping to give a voice to marginalized society, but also within the movement. So it's good to acknowledge that individuals are being marginalized in society, but I also want to make sure that marginalized individuals within the movement also have a voice. And last but not least, I want to be able to solidify the existence of heavy fat people in academia, because I feel like it's necessary, right? And representation means everything. And if somebody else sees you laughing and smiling and living the life that you're living, you know, you just might cause them to laugh and smile about their own life. And so having to work through this data first, I don't necessarily wish that on other people, to hear about the trouble and the heartache that goes into what it means to be stigmatized in society and what that feels like. And there was a study that was done a few years ago where they asked individuals what would they rather be besides fat, and people had responses like they'd rather lose a limb, they'd rather die 3 years early. And I think that when we have answers like this that happen, probably a good chance that we need to make some changes about the way that we talk about bodies and how we see them and view them in the media, and things of that nature. So, I'd like to acknowledge my chair and those in my committee, so somebody can tell them they did get acknowledged. I did mention them. And I thank you for your time. And are there any questions? I'm done. Any questions at all? Yes, ma'am.
So I'm actually curious about your thoughts on, oftentimes in social movement literature, you see a comparison between the institutionalized and uninstitutionalized action that people tend to take. And there's often this critique that those uninstitutionalized activities tend to not yield results, right? So what did your hashtag get you? What did eating ice cream in a park do to advance your movement? And so I'm curious about your thoughts on that in terms of how you're going to discuss that within your dissertation and your research, but also whether or not you see that as an issue in comparing them.
So I think that's twofold, right? Because I think that whenever you look at hashtags or you look at what the media is going to put out, I'm sure, depending on what type of media you're looking at, mainstream media will say, well, protest didn't yield anything, right? I think that's the same issue that you have in a lot of ways with Black Lives Matter, right? It's like all these protests, like what did you accomplish? You know, there's no policy change, right? But if you were to talk to members of Black Lives Matter, right, then the issue would be, no, like we're shaking and moving, right? People are paying us attention, we're getting the exposure that we want, we have a seat at the table. In a lot of ways where we didn't have one before. And so I think it depends on how, members of the movement are actually looking at those practices and what they're hoping to achieve by that. And so I don't think necessarily that people go out and protest without an extra component that leads to like policy change, right? Oftentimes protests are a way to get people's attention. And then once we have your attention, we'll move to the next step. And so I think depending on what I'm looking at, I think those answers will vary. But I would almost argue that activists are going to say, yeah, that's what we meant to do, and that's what we got. And we're happy with that. Like, we're going to keep moving forward. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm wondering a little, I feel like, I guess I'm just wondering a little bit more about that liberation movement and the role of men in the movement, because it does seem like it's probably driven by feminist perspectives and women, and looking for greater acceptance for women's bodies. And I guess I've seen more discourse publicly about women's bodies and fat acceptance that I've seen about acceptance for fat male bodies.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering about the representation of men in the movement, and if they're an equal player in that, or if women are primarily driving what's happening there.
Okay, so I wouldn't necessarily say that they're equal players.
Okay.
I do think that it is greater representation of women. Part of that I feel like is because women get the brunt of whatever weight stigma is, right? And so men can be Paul Bunyan, they can be husky, they can play football, they can have bellies, whereas women are like, why do you have a pouch, right? So, but I will say that considering, and I think that's an interesting point, because considering that NAFA was created by a man, right? But it was created by a man because he seen the need for a woman. And so what I do see, at least within plus size fashion, if that's what, I don't even think that's what men call their clothes, big and tall, right? But within that context, I do see that there's this emergence of larger men, right? No longer looking to necessarily be buff and strong, but, and I will say in some ways, like, that's promoted, right? So during this time is fall. I don't know if people know about cuffing season, so to speak. Everybody talks about like get you a teddy bear, and all of this, like, so that type of promotion is happening in these different, you know. But I also say in some ways it's very interesting how it's okay to have a teddy bear and not okay to have a woman teddy bear. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not okay to have a teddy bear in a woman context, so to speak. But again, it's not equally represented, no. But they do exist.
Can I ask another question? Yeah. So what's the role also in terms of non-fat people's involvement in the fat liberation movement? We look at other movements, you know, support for immigrants, support for Black Lives Matter, and there are people who aren't part of the group being represented who are advocating on their behalf. Are we seeing that?
Sure. So there's allies everywhere, right? And so we have the issue of smaller bodies, individuals who are standing with the movement. Obviously, not obviously, but again, it's not equal representation. You have individuals who are standing and saying, you know, I acknowledge the fact that I have privilege because I have a smaller body, but we should not fat shame other people. Those things are happening. But again, I think those are things that kind of ride under the radar. And I think part of that is kind of deliberate because part of the fat liberation movement is to make yourself visible. And it's hard to do that if you have a smaller body, right? And so fat individuals are saying, I'll go to the beach, right? And I mean, they have nice 2 pieces and the summertime was fun. So there are things that they're saying and they are putting their bodies on the line. But you do have smaller individuals, dietitians, so people who are within the medical community that are kind of using their privilege to kind of push back against this idea of what it means to be fat and quote unquote fit and quote unquote healthy. Sure. Any other questions?
Okay. Well, thank you, Joy. And thanks to everyone for coming out today. I just want to remind everyone about the DSA barbecue that's happening today at 5 o'clock over at Huntington House. So we'll take a little break between now and then while they get stuff set up. And I hope that you'll go over there and have a burger or a veggie burger or a vegan burger or a beverage and enjoy the
And also a round of applause for our director, Dr. Jen, who's actually putting most of our
Thank you.